The cold February dawn breaks across rural Michigan, 1945. Snow falls in heavy wet flakes across the barren fields of Oceana County, muffling the rumble of military trucks as they wind through empty country roads. Inside one of these olive-drab vehicles, 23 German soldiers sit in silence, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Their uniforms are threadbare, patched with whatever fabric could be found in the chaos of the collapsing Third Reich. These men, boys really, some barely 18, clutch their few possessions, a battered photograph of home, a worn Bible, perhaps a letter from a sweetheart whose fate they can only guess at. Private First Class Klaus Harriman presses his face to the ice-crusted window, watching the American countryside roll past. The farms here look different from the bombed-out landscapes of France he remembers from his retreat. These fields are intact, undisturbed by war. Barns stand whole, their red paint bright against the snow. There are no shell craters, no burned-out tanks rusting in hedgerows. This is what peace looks like, he realizes with a start. The truck slows, turning through a gate marked with signs in English that none of them can read. Through the snow, Klaus sees their destination. Not the concrete bunkers and guard towers he expected, but what appears to be a high school football field surrounded by a simple chain-link fence. Wooden barracks, hastily constructed but solid, line the perimeter. A group of American soldiers wait nearby, rifles slung casually over their shoulders, cigarettes glowing between their lips. They look tired, these Americans, but not cruel. Not like the Soviets Klaus had heard about from other prisoners. As the truck comes to a halt, Klaus feels his heart hammering against his ribs. Everything he had been told about Americans, everything the propaganda ministry had drilled into German minds for over a decade, comes flooding back. Joseph Goebbels had painted vivid pictures of American savagery, describing a nation of criminals and gangsters, a mongrel race corrupted by Jewish influence and Negro blood. America, the propaganda claimed, was a country without culture, without honor, a land where violence and greed reigned supreme. The Americans would torture their prisoners, Goebbels had promised. They would work them to death in labor camps, show them no mercy. The truck door swings open, and Klaus prepares for the worst. "All right, boys, let's go," calls out an American sergeant, his voice carrying the flat accent of the American Midwest. The German prisoners file out slowly, uncertainty written across their gaunt faces. Klaus notices something unexpected. The American guards are not pointing their weapons at them. Their rifles remain slung, their posture relaxed but alert. It is the stance of men doing a job, not the predatory crouch of torturers. The cold February air bites at Klaus's exposed skin as he stands in formation with his fellow prisoners. The American sergeant, a man in his 30s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, surveys them with what appears to be sympathy rather than contempt. When he speaks, his voice is firm but not harsh. "Gentlemen, welcome to Camp Shelby," he begins, pausing while an interpreter translates his words. "I know you're tired, you're cold, and you're scared, but you're safe now. We're going to get you fed, get you warm, and get you settled in. You'll be treated according to the Geneva Convention, which means you'll be treated with the same respect we'd once shown to our boys if they were in your position." Klaus exchanges glances with his comrades. This is not what they expected. Where are the clubs? Where are the snarling guard dogs? Where is the American brutality they had been promised? The prisoners are led into a large wooden building that serves as a processing center. The warmth hits them immediately, a blessed relief after the frigid truck ride. Along one wall, Klaus notices something that makes him do a double-take. A row of tables manned by American Red Cross volunteers, mostly women in their middle years, setting out steaming cups and plates of food. The aroma that fills the air is unlike anything Klaus has smelled in months. Real coffee, not the ersatz chicory brew that had become standard in Germany. And is that chocolate? The sweet, rich scent seems impossible after years of wartime rations. "Processing will take a few hours," the sergeant explains through the interpreter. "While you wait, the ladies from the Red Cross have prepared some refreshments for you." Klaus feels a lump form in his throat. Refreshments? For prisoners of war? This word seems to belong to a different world, a peacetime world of social gatherings and civilian pleasures. The women behind the tables smile at the German prisoners, actual smiles, warm and welcoming. Klaus had expected hatred, contempt, perhaps indifference. He had not expected kindness. The first prisoner in line, a teenage boy named Franz whose uniform hangs loose on his underfed frame, approaches the table hesitantly. An American woman with graying hair and laugh lines around her eyes hands him a steaming mug. "Coffee, honey," she says gently, even though she knows he cannot understand her words. Her tone is universal, the voice of a mother comforting a frightened child. Franz accepts the mug with trembling hands, inhaling the rich aroma before taking his first sip. His eyes widen in shock, then fill with tears. This is real coffee, stronger and richer than anything he had tasted even before the war began. He whispers a quiet "Danke schön" to the woman, who nods and pats his shoulder gently. Klaus watches this exchange with growing amazement. When his turn comes, he approaches the table like a man walking in a dream. The woman behind the counter, her name tag reads Mrs. Henderson, holds up two items, a mug of coffee and a chocolate bar still in its wrapper. "Take both, dear," she says, her voice carrying the patient warmth of a small-town schoolteacher. "You look like you need them." Klaus stares at the chocolate bar. It is a Hershey's bar, the kind he had seen in American movies before the war. The wrapper is clean, unrationed, abundant. In Germany, chocolate had become a luxury reserved for the highest party officials. Here it is being given freely to enemy prisoners. He takes a sip of the coffee and feels the warmth spread throughout his body, not just from the heat, but from something deeper. The simple human act of being offered comfort by a stranger. The chocolate melts on his tongue, sweet and smooth, tasting of a world where scarcity and rationing are unknown. Around the room, the same scene plays out 23 times. German prisoners, their eyes wide with disbelief, accept offerings of food and warmth from American women who have every reason to hate them. These Americans have sons and husbands fighting overseas, perhaps dying at the hands of German soldiers. Yet here they stand, serving coffee and chocolate to the enemy with gentle smiles. Klaus finds a seat on a wooden bench and cradles his coffee mug between his palms, letting the warmth seep into his cold fingers. Beside him, an older prisoner named Heinrich, a veteran of the First War who had been called back to service in 1944, shakes his head slowly. "Mein Gott," Heinrich whispers. "This is not what they told us it would be like." "What do you mean?" Klaus asks, though he thinks he already knows. Heinrich takes another sip of his coffee, savoring it like a fine wine. The propaganda. All those speeches about American savagery, about how they would torture us, starve us, work us to death like slaves. "Look around you, boy. Look at what they have done." Klaus does look around. He sees German prisoners being treated with basic human dignity by people who have every reason to despise them. He sees abundance where he expected deprivation, kindness where he expected cruelty. The cognitive dissonance is overwhelming. For years, the Nazi propaganda machine had painted America as a cultural wasteland, a nation without soul or honor. Americans were portrayed as materialistic, shallow, corrupted by Jewish influence and racial mixing. They were supposed to be weak, decadent, incapable of the kind of martial virtue that supposedly defined the German character. Yet here in this simple wooden building in rural Michigan, Klaus is witnessing something that contradicts every lesson he had been taught. The American women serving them are not weak or decadent. They are strong in a quiet way, secure in their values, confident in their choices. They offer comfort to their enemies, not because they have been ordered to, but because it is simply the right thing to do. There is no ceremony to this kindness, no propaganda value extracted. It is just ordinary human decency, as natural as breathing. As the hours pass and the processing continues, Klaus begins to understand that this first encounter is not an aberration. The American soldiers who fingerprint them and photograph them do so with professional efficiency, but no malice. The camp commander, a Colonel Morrison with steel-gray hair and a weathered face, addresses them in broken German, explaining that they will be housed in heated barracks, fed 3 meals a day, and allowed to write letters home. "We are not your enemies," the colonel says, his accent thick but his words clear. "We are soldiers doing our duty, just as you were soldiers doing yours. You will be treated as prisoners of war, not as criminals. You have my word on this." Klaus had been prepared for many things when he was captured near the Rhine 2 weeks earlier. He had prepared himself for death, for torture, for the kind of systematic brutality that had characterized the Eastern Front. He had not prepared himself for mercy. As evening falls and the prisoners are led to their barracks, Klaus carries with him the memory of that first taste of American coffee, that first bite of chocolate freely given. These simple gifts will stay with him throughout his captivity, symbols of a generosity that challenges everything he thought he knew about the world. The barracks, when they reach them, are another surprise. They are warm, heated by wood-burning stoves that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Each prisoner has his own bunk with clean sheets and a woolen blanket. There are windows, actual glass windows, not the bars and boards Klaus had expected. Through these windows, he can see the lights of the nearby town twinkling in the distance, a peaceful constellation of American homes where American families are sitting down to dinner, their sons and husbands fighting a war an ocean away. That night, lying on his narrow bunk and listening to the quiet breathing of his fellow prisoners, Klaus stares at the chocolate bar he has saved from the afternoon. He breaks off a single square and lets it melt on his tongue, savoring not just the sweetness, but the symbolism. This small piece of chocolate represents something larger, a crack in the wall of hatred and propaganda that had defined his world for so long. In the weeks that follow, Klaus will learn that this first encounter was not an anomaly, but the beginning of a new understanding. He will work alongside American farmers who treat him not as an enemy, but as a man. He will receive letters from American families who have heard about the German prisoners in their community and felt moved to reach out with small gifts and words of encouragement. He will discover that the America he had been taught to despise is not the America that actually exists. The days settle into a rhythm that bears no resemblance to the hellish captivity Klaus had expected. Reveille comes at dawn, but it is followed by a breakfast of real eggs, bacon, and bread with butter. Luxuries that had vanished from German tables years ago. The work details that follow are hard but fair. Klaus finds himself assigned to a local farm owned by the Teichmann family, German Americans whose grandparents had emigrated from Bavaria 3 generations earlier. Old Wilhelm Teichmann speaks to Klaus in accented German, his words carrying the comfortable cadence of the old country. "Mein Junge," he says, looking at Klaus's thin frame. "You work hard, I feed you well." This is how we do things here. The farmer's wife, a plump woman named Greta, packs extra sandwiches in Klaus's lunch pail when she thinks no one is looking. Sometimes she includes small wrapped candies, the kind her own son might enjoy if he weren't somewhere in the Pacific fighting Klaus's former allies. The routine of farm work, milking cows, mending fences, harvesting late winter vegetables from root cellars, provides Klaus with something he hadn't realized he craved: normalcy. Here, surrounded by the timeless rhythms of agricultural life, the ideology that had consumed Germany seems distant and abstract. What matters is whether the cow gives milk, whether the fence keeps the livestock contained, whether the vegetables are stored properly against the cold. At noon each day, Mrs. Teichmann calls the workers in for lunch. Klaus sits at the same table as the American farmhands, eating the same food, sharing the same jokes translated through the universal language of work and exhaustion. Sometimes when the conversation turns to the war, an uncomfortable silence falls over the table. But more often the talk is of ordinary things: the weather, the crops, the small gossip of rural life. It is during one of these lunches that Klaus experiences perhaps the most profound moment of his captivity. A neighbor woman, Mrs. Sullivan, arrives with news that her son Patrick has been killed in Germany. Killed, she says through her tears, by German artillery near the Rhine. Klaus freezes, his sandwich halfway to his mouth, waiting for the explosion of rage, the demands for vengeance. Instead, Mrs. Sullivan looks at him with red-rimmed eyes and says simply, "You're just boys, aren't you?" Just boys like my Patrick. The weight of that moment settles over Klaus like a physical presence. This woman whose son died at the hands of Klaus's former comrades sees him not as a monster, but as someone's child. Her grief is profound, but it is not poisoned by hatred. It is clean in its sorrow, dignified in its restraint. In the evenings back at the camp, Klaus writes letters home on paper provided by the American authorities. These letters are censored, but the censorship is gentle, removing only information that might be militarily useful. Klaus's descriptions of his treatment, his expressions of gratitude for American kindness, pass through unchanged. He knows his family will read these words and struggle to believe them, just as he struggled to believe his own experience. The camp library becomes another revelation. Stocked with books in German, it contains works that had been banned by the Nazi regime. Philosophy, literature, political theory that offered alternatives to the totalitarian worldview Klaus had been taught to embrace. He reads Goethe and Schiller with new eyes, understanding for the first time the humanistic values that had been stripped from German culture in favor of racial ideology and military conquest. But it is the American books, translated into German, that truly transform his understanding. He reads about democracy not as the weak, chaotic system described by Nazi propaganda, but as a complex balance of competing interests held together by shared values and constitutional law. He learns about American history, the struggles for independence, the Civil War fought to end slavery, the gradual expansion of rights and opportunities that had made America a beacon for the oppressed of the world. Winter gives way to spring, and with the warming weather comes news of Germany's inevitable defeat. The guards at Camp Shelby treat this news not with triumphant celebration, but with somber relief. They know, as Klaus is beginning to understand, that the end of the war means the beginning of an even more difficult task: rebuilding a world torn apart by hatred and ideology. As Klaus tends the Teichmann's spring planting, he finds himself planning for a future he had never expected to see. The chocolate bar from his first day, long since consumed, has been replaced by other small kindnesses. A book from Mrs. Henderson, a hand-knitted scarf from Mrs. Sullivan, letters from American schoolchildren who have adopted the German prisoners as pen pals. Each gesture builds upon the last, creating a foundation of trust and understanding that no amount of propaganda can shake. The transformation is not universal. Some prisoners cling to their old beliefs, dismissing American kindness as weakness or manipulation. They count the days until they can return to Germany and rebuild the Reich. But they are the minority. Most of Klaus's fellow prisoners have undergone the same quiet revolution of understanding that has changed his own heart. When the war finally ends in May 1945, Klaus feels not celebration, but a complex mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that the killing has stopped, that the madness is over. Sadness for the millions who died, for the civilization that destroyed itself, for the young man he had been who believed so fervently in lies. The chocolate bar he received on that cold February day had been more than a sweet comfort. It had been the first crack in the wall of hatred that had imprisoned his mind. Through that crack had poured light, the light of human decency, of moral complexity, of the understanding that enemies could become friends if treated with dignity, rather than demonized through propaganda. Years later, when Klaus returns to Germany as part of the reconstruction effort, he carries with him not just memories of American kindness, but a new understanding of what civilization could be. He becomes a translator, helping to bridge the gap between former enemies who must now become allies. He marries a German teacher who shares his commitment to democratic values, and together they raise children who grow up in a world where German and American soldiers stand guard together against new threats to freedom. The cup of coffee and chocolate bar that began Klaus's transformation becomes symbols of something larger: the power of ordinary human kindness to overcome the most sophisticated machinery of hatred. In choosing mercy over vengeance, abundance over scarcity, the American people had won a victory more complete than any military conquest. They had proven that their values were not just pretty words, but living principles strong enough to extend even to their enemies. This is the lesson that echoes through the decades, that the true strength of a nation lies not in its ability to destroy its enemies, but in its capacity to transform them into friends. The America that Klaus discovered in that Michigan prisoner camp was not the America of Goebbels' fevered imagination, but something far more powerful, a country secure enough in its own values to extend them even to those who had sought its destruction. The snow that fell on that February night in 1945 has long since melted, but the warmth of that first cup of coffee, that first taste of freely given chocolate, remains undiminished in the memory of an old man who learned that the most radical act in a world consumed by hatred is the simple decision to be kind to a stranger. In the end, that may be the most important victory of all.